Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this World Council of Credit Unions virtual training session. My name is Liz Stanislawski, and I'm the Director of Communications for the World Council of Credit Unions. Before we get started, please take a moment to select your preferred language using the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen, English or Portuguese. Today's session focuses on proactive succession planning and how credit unions can turn regulatory compliance into an opportunity for strategic growth. Designed for executives and board leaders, this webinar will walk through how to build and implement a thoughtful succession plan that supports continuity while strengthening leadership for the future. We'll explore how to design a strategic and compliant succession plan tailored to your credit union structure and capabilities, how to identify and develop internal talent through mentorship and leadership development, and how to use practical tools and best practices to manage leadership transitions in a way that supports organizational growth and innovation. We're joined today by Nell Callan, partner at Curtis Strategy in the United States, who will share guidance and real-world insights on building strong leadership pipelines and preparing for change with confidence. If you do have questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will get to as many as time allows. This session is being recorded and will be available on Woku's YouTube channel later this week. With that, I'm happy to turn it over to our presenter, Nell. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Liz, for that introduction. It's wonderful to be with you all today. My name is Nell Callan. I am a partner with Curtis Strategy. We specialize in working with nonprofit organizations on strategic transformation initiatives, and I lead our credit union sector. My work focuses primarily on initiatives like organization design, board governance, consolidation strategy, as well as succession planning, which obviously brings us to our topic today. And I'm very excited to be with you all to talk about opportunities to turn what can be a regulatory compliance strategy into real opportunities for strategic growth as a credit union. So some of the things I want to talk through today are first setting some context around the importance of succession planning, and how oftentimes as busy leaders, we know that it can be deprioritized as an organization unintentionally. And how do we kind of make meaningful time to reprioritize this strategic initiative? We'll also talk about who's responsible for succession planning. And a quick hint here, it's not human resources. As in all things, I think accountability and role clarity are really important. So setting that framework for who needs to be responsible is a critical place to begin. We'll also talk through how to build a successful succession plan and the steps that you need to take, and then walk through a couple of exercises to help you get started in your succession planning efforts. So first, let's discuss the strategic imperative of succession planning and really why this is so important. And again, how to kind of turn your succession planning initiatives from that regulatory compliance strategy, more of a check the box and a document that may sit on your desk, kind of potentially gathering dust until you need it, into a real active strategy for your credit union. Succession planning, when we do it right, can provide an opportunity to safeguard institutional memory, helps us manage change and risk appropriately, minimizing disruption, and also gives us opportunity to really emphasize our core cooperative values and the credit union's mission. This can be a strategic initiative that empowers the next generation of leadership and fosters organizational resilience. And we know all of this as leaders, but oftentimes we find that succession planning can be deprioritized because we may be experiencing a number of other trends and priorities that take precedence for us. So some of the things that we're seeing in the credit union sector that lead to that accidental deprioritization can be things like technology advancement. We really see the pace of change in the technology and AI space rapidly accelerating. What we were planning for in a 10-year timeline is now something that may be here in the next 5 years. And so, how do we kind of balance that priority, as well as the business models of credit unions themselves can be evolving? Right? We used to have a kind of brick and mortar branching strategy, and now pivoting that to much more heavily online banking. And those are member expectations that are shifting, as well as kind of generational preferences around member loyalty and things like that. Of course, credit unions are also facing competition from for-profits and fintechs, and all of those trends really leading towards consolidation in the sector, as a means of kind of competitive advantage and scale, for credit unions to continue to be successful. Of course, there are changes in the regulatory environment that you all are kind of combating as well, and the talent acquisition and workforce space becoming increasingly more competitive, as well as, of course, the rapid retirement of executive leadership. We are facing a talent cliff when it comes to really senior leadership in the credit union space. And of course, that brings us again to our topic today of succession planning. A recent study from the Meyer Foundation showed that nearly 70% of C-suite executives in the nonprofit space are considering an exit strategy in the next 5 years. And unfortunately, a similar study from SHRM last year, the Society for Human Resources Management, showed that only 18% of boards are confident that they can navigate that CEO transition without a defined succession plan. So that's a huge gap for us as leaders and of our organizations, and again, really emphasizing kind of the need to prioritize succession as a strategy here. There are three primary dimensions to succession planning that we need to be thinking about in crafting our process, and how to kind of navigate those effectively. So, if we break down those components into political, emotional, and kind of a rational dimension, it really helps us think about the steps that we need to take to craft an appropriate process. So, first, thinking about the political dimension of succession planning that can make it so difficult to navigate an effective process successfully. This could be things like an internal candidate race. Perhaps you have multiple individuals at your credit union who would be potentially considered for the CEO succession, and that can lead to kind of pitting potential candidates against each other, can lead to tension within the team, as well as potentially factions within the board developing around who's supporting which candidate's opportunity for succession. That again, that can kind of underscore some divisions within the credit union, and potentially even outside stakeholders or members having some interest as well. If you think about maybe the difference between your chief membership officer being considered for succession and potentially, let's say, your chief lending officer, and what relationships those individuals bring to the table themselves can have an impact on your planning efforts. Now, when we think about the emotional component of succession planning, we want to think about the CEO's own attitude towards their retirement. Sometimes we work with individuals who've been in their seat for a very long time, or potentially even founders of the credit union, which can be a difficult situation to kind of navigate that emotional component towards stepping down. Again, ensuring that leadership continuity, but balancing legacy as well. Now, the CEO themselves is going to obviously have important relationships that need to be maintained and transferred over in the process. But those can lead to, kind of an emotional experience for team members as well, because individuals may have been working for these executives for a long period of time. You may start to hear comments like, well, if you go, I go. And this is where we really run into institutional risk around that kind of knowledge gap, or transitioning that knowledge and relationships appropriately. Again, it's really important to navigate that risk in a mindful standpoint and retain as much institutional knowledge as possible and those relationships as well. And finally, we have a rational component to succession planning. And this is really all about process and setting up a methodology that's objective and fair. giving people transparency into when decisions will be made, and their consideration. And that rational dimension can really help us navigate the political and the emotional components as well. Because if we're creating a meaningful transition plan and creating that transparency around the process, again, it creates a better experience for everyone involved, and helps kind of combat those two potentially more sticky dynamics within succession planning. So next, I want to talk through who's responsible for succession. Now that we've kind of defined the importance and emphasized what we need to be considering as we move through the process, let's talk about who is responsible for what. And I want to start here by presenting an organizational design principle called the manager once removed. Now, I imagine that many of you on this call have direct reports yourselves. And if that one of those direct reports were to resign their position, I would hope that you would be responsible for filling that vacancy yourself, and you wouldn't allow that person to backfill or hire their own replacement. Now, that's because of a principle, again, called the manager once removed. Now, in this principle, we see that manager once removed role has the objective view over what's required in that position itself. So in this case, the CEO is the manager once removed to a director or a VP level. If the COO were to leave, the CEO would have the objective view into a director or a VP's potential in filling that COO gap. They've hopefully mentored some of that talent to identify those capabilities themselves. And they also have the objective view over what's required in the COO role, thinking beyond what is required or what is performed in the role today, and thinking really more future oriented about what we might need in the position in the future. And it's not a reflection on the current talent's capabilities at all to say that based on the trends that we're facing as an industry, we might need to think differently about the capabilities required in this role. Now, the COO in this case is the manager and really responsible for kind of that coaching, that day-to-day job performance, and elevating those directors and the VP levels to kind of prepare them for readiness. So we can apply that same manager once removed principle to succession planning. And here, if we're talking about the CEO position and succession planning for that role, it's the board of directors that has the manager once removed position into the executive team's capabilities. So the board's going to need that exposure to the executive team. They're going to need to have some of that mentorship relationship, and they're also going to need to take that long-term strategic perspective about what's required in the CEO role. And again, not a reflection on current capabilities at all here to say that what our needs are in the future might be different than what they are today. The CEO in this case really has the management responsibility to advise on those internal candidates' potential readiness. And they also importantly have the responsibility to establish a culture of development and succession throughout the organization, really making that a priority for the entire credit union and ensuring that those pathways exist for senior leadership to excel. So again, succession can be a really heavy lift for the board of directors when we're talking about that CEO succession responsibility, but it truly is their first and most important responsibility to ensure that leadership continuity for the future. Now, for CEOs on the call, I know some of that can feel sticky when we apply that to ourselves and our role. It can be really difficult to kind of empower your own board to move into that manager once removed role and give them sort of the tools and the objective insights into the organization. But if we think back to that emotional component in succession, it's so critical to be able to pass that torch effectively and empower the board to lead that process. So let's talk a little bit more detail about who's going to own what when it comes to CEO succession. So the board's role in this process is really to fully own the CEO succession plan and the entire process. Now, the board can empower a committee to run those functions, maybe an ad hoc committee or running that through an executive committee. Sometimes that can be a more efficient way to tackle that rational component than engaging the entire board in the process. It's also the board's responsibility to determine the strategic needs of the organization. Again, thinking about those trends that we are facing, what are the needs and the changes that we might see in our CEOs that we need to be preparing for the future. Again, being responsible for the entire process, the board would be hiring and engaging any consultants in that process, from executive search to succession planning to interim placement firms, as well as conducting the search itself on an internal basis and an external basis. There are lots of different pathways to succession that we want to consider. And so making sure that the board has a robust plan around pursuing both of those different options. The board would also be responsible for transitioning the outgoing CEO and any associated retention packages that need to be in place to facilitate that transition, as well as ensuring that knowledge retention at the rest of the senior leadership level. We again want to avoid those you go, I go type situations. And of course, any kind of negotiations around the incoming CEO's contract and compensation. The board's also going to be responsible for onboarding and orienting the new CEO. Remember that if your CEO comes from within the credit union, there's still an orientation process that needs to occur regarding building relationship and transferring all of that knowledge and the different relationships over to the new individual. And then finally, any kind of communications planning, both internally and externally. We want to make sure that that messaging comes from the board, led by the chair usually, but in partnership with the outgoing CEO. So what is the CEO's role in their own succession then? First is to really review and offer suggestions on that job description and those expectations for, again, what the trends that you're seeing and how we might need to envision this role differently. Providing support to the communications process and ensuring that your team understands that this is a process that you are bought into. And really ensuring that they understand that you support their candidacy for succession, and kind of eliminating any potential tension there. I think approaching succession from a strategic lens, and again, kind of that vision of this is something that's good for our organizational resilience. It needs to go beyond the what happens if I get hit by a bus, or as I like to say, win the lottery. And really thinking about that organizational resilience and the strategies that we need in place to kind of envision the future of our credit unions. So building that buy-in with the team, making sure that they have freedom to participate in the process and be encouraged to participate in the process fully. Helping to identify potential senior leadership candidacy as well as retention risks. So thinking about those individuals on your team who you've worked with for a really long time, who again may want to step down shortly after yourself, and then providing support in the transition after a hire has been made, or to really kind of build the skills of the selection of the candidate that's been selected. And finally, and potentially most importantly here, really succession planning for the rest of the organization. This is so critical, again, to ensure that this is part of our culture and that we don't get into situations where you're needing to shop hungry, but you have a bench strength within the credit union of individuals who could potentially step up, and that trickles down throughout all of leadership so that you're not just passing the buck of that kind of potential gap down the road. So now that we've talked a little bit about who is responsible for what in the process, I want to talk about how to actually build a plan that prepares the organization for change. And first thing I want to kind of talk through here is two phases that we need to separate our succession efforts into. So again, there are lots of different pathways that we can think about succession, but grouping your process into these two major phases is going to be really helpful in terms of envisioning what needs to happen next. So first, we like to call that first phase assessment and alignment. In this phase, we're really building role clarity. Again, putting that in context of future needs of the organization. We're doing candidate assessments here to figure out if we have internal talent who could be capable of filling those roles and those gaps in the future. Or we're identifying places where if we don't have the internal talent, or it may be a long time before that talent is ready to step into the role, what are the different skills that we need to develop in order to prepare those individuals or knowledge that needs to be transferred in order to help them become ready. And then we're designing multiple pathways so that, again, we have many different options here about what can help us be successful in our succession planning efforts. This could be cultivating internal options. This might be envisioning external hires and what that process from a timelining standpoint would look like or a communication standpoint would look like. And it's also potentially considering interim search or sometimes even consolidation as a means of succession. So we really want to cultivate multiple options here so that we're prepared when it comes time to think about transition management. Now, in transition management, we would be potentially coaching some of our internal hires to provide them with the skills and the tools that they need to be ready to lead. We also want to think about communications planning here. Again, think back to that rational component and how to kind of mitigate some of those risks. Well, transparency in communication is a great way to do that. So making sure that from an internal perspective, your teams have insight at the appropriate times and they understand when they'll be communicated with next, as well as the membership. We want to make sure that they feel confident that we're navigating this transition appropriately as well, so that we're mitigating risk to the credit union. And then finally, thinking through an effective onboarding process that we can use to transfer, again, all of that knowledge, all of those relationships, and really set the new leader up for success in their role. So the first tool that I want to share with you today is something called the Job PAC exercise. And PAC is an acronym that stands for Purpose, Activities, and KPIs, Key Performance Indicators. Now, this is something that we use in that assessment and alignment phase for really all of our succession planning efforts. And there's a couple of different ways that you can use this tool, but I first want to highlight how it's a little bit different than a traditional job description. So a job description is really built around mitigating risk to the organization from an HR perspective. If you think about kind of that bullet in the job description that says ad hoc responsibilities or anything and everything my manager asks me to do and then some, the PAC, in contrast, is really all about the primary activities that add value for the credit union, thinking about the strategic purpose and highest and best use of a position for the organization. And it's really helps us kind of focus on that future-oriented mindset as well. So we're going to use the job PAC in a couple of different ways in our succession planning efforts. The first is to ask that manager once removed. So again, if we're talking about the CEO role, we're going to ask the board to prepare a job PAC for the CEO position, taking in mind all of those trends and kind of the future that we need to be prepared for. So we're going to ask the board to craft a mission statement, that primary purpose of the CEO function. We're going to ask to craft kind of the most important 5 activities that add value and help the CEO achieve that mission. And then we're going to ask you to define what are some of the metrics that we could use to measure success. Now, we can use this tool at any level within the organization for the same way. So that manager, once removed, prepares the job PAC. And then we're going to ask our candidates that we're considering for the role to also prepare a job PAC for the position. This is going to give us some great alignment and help us build that potential gap analysis, if one exists, between what our expectations are and what our potential candidates' expectations are about the position that they may be filling. It's going to give us great insights into how we can kind of tweak their vision for the role if needed, or kind of reprioritize those efforts, or potentially even if someone shouldn't be considered for the role because the gap is too big and our timeline wouldn't support developing them into being capable of filling that role. So I'm going to just provide an example here so that you can have a little bit more context into how this might be used. So here I've presented a job pack for a chief lending officer. So this is something that the CEO has crafted to assess the candidates for that chief lending officer position. So they've said that the primary purpose, the mission of this role is to ensure balanced growth and profitability of the credit union's loan portfolio. The chief lending officer is going to do that by developing lending strategies and growth targets that attract new members and deepen existing relationships, to also set the credit union's risk tolerance and internal policies and procedures for quality control, of course, ensure regulatory compliance of the portfolio, collaborate with the marketing team to develop new products and promotional strategies based on data insights, and to supervise, support, and develop the rest of the lending team, including all of the kind of front office revenue driving functions, as well as the back office operations and support. Now, we can measure the chief lending officer's success through the growth of the lending portfolio, its profitability, growth in membership, the depth of wallet of members, kind of products per member, and of course, clean audit results. Now, as we go to assess internal candidates for their potential in fulfilling this chief lending officer gap, we're again going to be able to show kind of some differences in how people perceive the role, whether or not there's alignment in our vision of what success looks like and how we would approach kind of the most important activities of this position. And if we don't have internal candidates, this is also going to give us a really effective tool to go out and post for that job and hire externally, because we know that candidates who are accountability focused and really results driven are going to appreciate those KPIs being public and kind of clear and communicated well as having that tie to the mission and kind of prioritizing those cooperative principles as a credit union. We can kind of engage with that talent on a mission standpoint and a productivity standpoint in a different way. So it's also really important as we're planning for succession to think about some of those soft skills that are required in our leaders. So there's a simple formula in my mind of what it means to be an effective leader, and that is to set direction, align resources, inspire action, and be 100% accountable for the results of those actions, whether positive or negative. We want to make sure that we're developing leaders who are able to work on our business instead of always in the business, really distinguishing kind of between the value in layers of our organization. So having that visionary mindset, setting that direction, and then being able to enroll others in that vision and inspire action around it is going to be critical capabilities that we're developing or identifying in our future leaders. We also want to make sure that they understand how to support their teams in getting those results. So making sure that they're resourcing them effectively from a system standpoint, a time standpoint, a capacity standpoint. And again, that accountability component is also going to be critical for success. Now, I would also add into this formula the alignment with the organizational values and our cooperative principles, making sure that we have the opportunity to both objectively assess this talent, as well as, kind of have some of those more subjective and soft skill measurements that we're developing in our leaders as well. So some of the tools that you can use to kind of assess some of these softer skills are things like 360-degree evaluations, where you're gathering feedback beyond that manager-employee relationship. Maybe you're soliciting feedback from someone's direct reports or the membership or vendors that they're working with, or even skip level feedback or feedback directly from interactions with the board. We can also ask leaders to reflect on their own leadership capabilities and performing some kind of style self-assessments as well. I think it can give really great insight into their ability in these kind of five major areas. And then finally, I would add in, the opportunity to kind of assess their understanding of vision and strategy through participation in strategic planning as an initiative. This gives you a really great insight into what context do they see for the credit union in the future. How can we kind of align, maybe their department vision and plans to the overall strategy of the organization and kind of test out their ability to align those resources and kind of set direction in a meaningful way. So, what does it actually look like if we're using all of those tools, and how can we really kind of assess someone's readiness across those five core areas? So, some of again, through those 360-degree tools and kind of the interviews and feedback gathering process, we want to set up an objective measurement by which we can compare and contrast candidates easily. So we might use we might use kind of statements or Likert scale style questions to do that. And then we're able to kind of average out candidate readiness scores in those key areas. So what I've done here is put together kind of a comparison with two potential candidates within the credit union for that chief lending officer position. So one candidate in red, the job pack exercise that they put together said that the primary purpose of the chief lending officer was to preserve member relationships and the credit union's reputation through loss prevention and recovery. Now we have another candidate who said that the primary purpose of that role is to ensure the growth and competitive positioning of the mortgage portfolio and products. So one being a little bit more growth oriented, but specific to one particular loan product, and one being a little bit more kind of back office and operational focused, but obviously has that external context around member relationship and kind of reputational focus as well. Now, when we average those scores out that across kind of those five key areas, we see that the individual in blue is performing very well across their strategic mindset ability, their ability to influence action, their accountability, and their alignment with the organizational values. They're scoring a little bit lower in kind of that operational expertise category, which is something that we may or may not be concerned about given the depth of talent that we have that could be kind of reporting into this function. So maybe we need to prioritize that strategic mindset over that operational expertise. Now, the candidate in red, again, scoring a little bit lower on that strategic mindset, but quite well across all of the other categories as well. And so some of the things that we need to think about here when we're thinking about our candidate readiness is what's our timeline for needing succession? Now, both of these individuals may have potential, but what are the kind of development pathways that we need to create, and how quickly do we think we can do that development in order for them to be ready to succeed into that next chief lending officer role? So, as thinking through the types of development that your talent might actually need, I like to bucket this into three major categories called training, developing, and upskilling. Training is really all about technical expertise and building readiness to perform in the current role. This is about empowering individuals to kind of own their current job relatively autonomously with the proper kind of risk framework in place. Again, building their technical expertise and kind of giving them the tools and the technical training that they need to perform well and be held accountable to deliver results in that job that they're in today. We can test individuals' ability to, or how well they've been trained and kind of their ability to excel here through a goal setting process that allows them to set individual goals, execute on those goals, and make sure that those goals are aligned to kind of a larger department or business plan that we may have in place. Now, developing is really more about kind of building some of those soft skills and leadership competencies that we've discussed. So here we're talking about coaching teams to performance, learning how to develop or train others on our team, and extending the time horizons in which individuals are operating. So individuals who are being trained appropriately are thinking more in a day-to-day context, sometimes week to week or month to month, whereas developing individuals are starting to think more quarter to quarter or year to year. Again, really extending that time horizon in which they're operating so that they can start to think about kind of the interoperability of the credit union and how they need to maybe be working cross-functionally to achieve specific goals or plans that they have. A great way to develop individuals here is asking them to lead a kind of cross-functional team project or engagement. Again, helping them kind of build context within the organization at large and build credibility within other teams within the credit union. Now, we're going to be able to test their abilities here and how well they've been developed through their ability to business plan effectively for their function. So again, thinking through what are the larger goals of a department? How can we kind of drive those goals forward? What resources does my team need in order to be successful? And again, their ability to execute then on that business plan. Now, finally, upskilling is really about kind of building leadership and the ability to kind of position as a capable and credible leader in an external context or kind of with the membership or within the industry at large. So people who are upskilling in our organizations are likely going to need a mentor. That's someone who's not their boss. And they're also going to serve as great mentors for others, employees who are developing or training as well, relying on this pool of talent to help develop and kind of train the rest of the credit union is going to be really critical in ensuring that bench strength and preserving those cooperative principles. Now, again, this is about kind of building that external context. So giving them the opportunity to participate in strategic planning and using that as an assessment tool for their capabilities here is also critical. We can think about extending that time horizon even farther here. Are these individuals able to plan on an annual basis? Are they able to think in a multi-year context? And again, having that vision and insights into how can we kind of position ourselves effectively as a credit union overall versus just one department that they may be prioritizing or leading. Now, it's also important to note that your team members may spend years in each of these phases, and they may toggle back and forth between phases as well. It's not a completely linear process. So think about, as you get promoted, as you advance in the organization, you may need to kind of step back into a training role to build those technical skills and the expertise that you need to be really successful in that role. So when we use these appropriately and we pair our development opportunities with the appropriate level and the appropriate needs of an individual, again, we can be much more mindful about building that bench strength and ensuring succession readiness. So the first exercise that I want to discuss today is really all about team succession. So as we were just discussing, right, there are multiple opportunities and kind of pairing those opportunities appropriately for our teams are going to be really critical to ensuring our pipeline of succession candidates. Presenting this leverage model as a means to say that, we know as organizations that not all of our individual contributors can be promoted successfully to managers. Not all of those managers will be promoted up to our kind of future leaders as well. And so thinking about the skills and the needs of that talent to advance is really critical. Oftentimes, we are promoting our talent based on their ability to perform in the job that they're in today and not thinking about their ability to perform in that job in the future. So I want to present a tool to you first that will help define kind of what the employees need and again, the opportunities that we can then align to that to help them be successful in those future roles. So this tool is a performance management matrix. And I want you to think just quickly about maybe a potential succession need that you have on your team or you anticipate coming about on your team, and one or two candidates that you think may have potential to be ready for that role. Now, I'm going to ask you to take those one or two candidates that you think may be ready and plot them into this four-quadrant matrix according to two things. The first is on the y-axis, their measurable results, their KPIs, right? Think back to that job pack. And are they delivering concrete results in their job performance? So what are the things that make that individual successful? If they're a high performer there, they're going to be in one of these top two quadrants. If they're not delivering results, they may fall into, consistently, they may fall into one of these bottom two quadrants. Now, layer on top of that their kind of observable behaviors or those more soft skills, those leadership competencies we discussed. So, their ability to kind of align with the organizational values, their ability to resource a team, to think strategically, all of those qualities. And again, if they're performing well on those observable behaviors, they're going to fall into to one of these two quadrants here. If they're not performing so well there, they need some additional development, they may be falling into one of these two quadrants here. So just take a moment and kind of based on those two factors, plot those individuals' initials into the appropriate quadrants where they fall. And I'll give you just a moment to do that now. Wonderful. So let's talk about the candidates that you have in this top right-hand quadrant here. These are really the future leaders of our organizations. If if you have individuals on your team who are consistently performing well in their role and they're exhibiting all of the targeted leadership behaviors and qualities that we want to see, these are the individuals that you need to continue to upskill and give them those opportunities for advancement because they really have kind of the most potential to be successful as our future leaders. Now, keep in mind that as we challenge these individuals and we give them more opportunities to grow and upskill, they may fall back down into one of these two quadrants here. As they potentially advance in the organization, they may not be quite as successful in the role that you've put them into now. So they may need some training in order to kind of develop those skills and have those meaningful results again. But our goal would be to bring them back up through training into this top right-hand quadrant here. Now, if they've fallen off into this category, this kind of top left-hand quadrant over here, they may need some development in order to kind of bring those soft skills back to light. They may be struggling to lead in this new context. So giving them some opportunities to develop those soft skills and reprioritize those. And again, hopefully move them back over into this superstar quadrant over here. So again, upskilling opportunities are going to be most appropriate for the top right-hand quadrant. Development opportunities are going to be most appropriate for the top left-hand quadrant. Training opportunities will be most appropriate for your bottom right-hand quadrant. And suffice it to say that if individuals are consistently falling into this bottom left quadrant, they're unable to meet results and they're not exhibiting the behaviors that we want to see, the best thing we can probably do for our credit union is move them out of the organization. So we don't need to spend a lot of time talking about individuals falling here. Now, the second exercise that I want to talk about today is really all about board succession. We've been talking a lot about team succession and readiness, but I do think it's important to think through what are the tools and kind of the skills that we need to be developing in our boards and particularly in our board officers, our board leaders, to think through that succession as well. So some of the things that are really critical for our boards to have are going to be kind of familiarity with the credit union's operations, a deep understanding of the sector and the challenges that may be facing us in the future, We want to have our board members have a really comprehensive understanding of our current strategies, our strategic plan, and the potential implications of our plan so that when it comes down to resourcing discussions, we can have meaningful understanding about prioritizing efforts, as well as, kind of understanding the future needs of our credit unions. And of course, developing those strong leadership and kind of clear ownership through committees, through our officer positions, establishing those clear lines of accountability, making sure that our boards are really oversight boards or properly engaged and not, working kind of in the operations of the credit union itself. So we want to build opportunities for training and development of the board that maximizes these 5 areas. And this is a real opportunity for our CEOs and our board chairs to partner together on developing a regular cadence around what those educational opportunities need to look like and kind of the current gaps that we may have and need to be filling on a board governance level. So the second exercise here that I'm going to ask you to think about is really about the current skills and the skills gaps that you may have from a board perspective. So if we think back to those trends that we're facing, potentially AI or kind of the membership models shifting, or consolidation or workforce challenges and kind of recruiting and developing talent, thinking about all of those trends, if you will kind of populate some of the most important skills that you think your board needs to have in order to be competitive and kind of be that thought partner for you as a credit union leader, populate those into the skills column here. Now, we can also think about prioritizing those skills based on, a scale of 1 to 5. So is this a top priority for us? Would it be more important for us to have AI skill versus, say, kind of the workforce skill? Are we in a union environment? Is that expertise going to be more valuable to us than kind of maybe more on the technical side or the financial side? So it's important to think about not just the skills we need, but how urgently we're going to need them. And then do we have this skill on our board today? And if so, how does that stack up against the particular director's term limits and, kind of prioritizing our recruitment efforts for ensuring we can retain that skill and that knowledge base on the board in the future? Or if we don't have that skill today, again, is this a skill that we need, and how are we going to go about targeting acquiring that skill in the future? Are there particular board members who have a base of knowledge or expertise or networks that we can rely on to kind of recruit that talent from outside? Are there particular areas of the membership that we know or kind of particular segs that we can target that would have the experience that we can kind of go out and ask to come on and fulfill that skills-based gap that we may have? So I think carving out the opportunity for our current board leaders and our CEO to really partner together on what are the skills that we need and how are we going to prioritize those as a board is a great next step in your board succession efforts. And then finally today, I just want to kind of talk a little bit about, how do we make sure that once we've crafted a meaningful plan, how do we ensure that it's successful, right? How do we make sure that our transitions are smooth, and that our plans, again, don't just kind of sit gathering dust, that these are meaningful plans that we can actually put into practice for our credit unions. So first is really thinking about steps after the hire has been made, again, internal or external, but how can we transition that knowledge and transition those relationships effectively to the new individual in the role? And the first thing to think about here is really providing onboarding, meaningful onboarding experience and pairing that with organizational mentors. And this can be kind of knowledge based or relationship based, but making sure that we have the opportunity to maximize that transition throughout the process. Second is to prioritize developing those relationships. So this might be with the board for other board members. This might be with the board for key leaders, with their own team, again, outside the credit union, with your membership, with auditors, whatever the most important relationships are for them to transition and prioritize and start to own. We want to make sure that we're elevating that as part of our transition management efforts. Again, here, thinking through strategic planning, business planning, goal setting, and budgeting. It's going to be so critical that as a leader, they have the opportunity to reflect or make changes on any of these strategies, depending upon what's in the scope of their role to own. We want to make sure that our future leaders are not kind of being saddled with decisions or plans that they didn't necessarily agree to, and maybe need to change in the future. And the same thing goes for kind of the team that they are potentially overseeing. So there may be some kind of natural or planned turnover that they need to create to make sure that the team is one that they feel can be effective in executing their future roles. And being open to kind of managing that culture change and shift as you go throughout the process. And finally, we haven't talked about this a ton today, but if you've pursued merger as a pathway to succession, of course, making sure that the integration process goes smoothly, and that you are, again, managing kind of that massive culture shift potentially. And finally, just some things to remember here to ensure success throughout the process is communicating transparently. Even though it can be difficult to communicate with your candidates if they're no longer being considered or you've selected someone else for the role, it's so critical to maintain that transparency, and really provide regular updates on kind of your progress through your planning efforts. We want to make sure that we have metrics to evaluate the effectiveness of our plans and track progress over time. So are people hitting their development benchmarks? And if not, how do we get back on track so that we're ready to have someone step into the role when they need to be? Again, succession planning is not a one-time event. So there are going to be external forces and things you can't control that mean that you need to kind of continuously reflect on your plan and make updates. That can be those external trends or the regulatory environment that you might be facing, as well as changes in the team and attrition that you may need to account for. Also critically important to think about seeking out diverse perspectives that really add to the capabilities of your leadership team. We often think about prioritizing culture fit, but I would advise prioritizing culture add. So who makes us better as a credit union? And we know that diverse teams perform better, so ensuring that we have those diverse perspectives and not always thinking about what was successful in the past, but what could be successful in this role in the future. And finally, embracing change. We know that succession can often, be an indicator of great change for a credit union, and organizations, just like people, can be resistant to change. So you need to help your employees kind of embrace that change and see this as an opportunity instead of a loss for the organization. So with that, I just want to thank you all for taking the time to talk through this, sometimes sticky and emotional concept of succession planning today. I hope you feel more prepared to begin your succession planning efforts or come back to and revise your planning efforts, and that you're more confident in kind of taking those next steps based on our conversation. But with that, I'll open it up for any questions. And Liz, if there are questions in the chat, I'll pass it off to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Nell, for that amazing presentation. I think you provided a lot of great insight and perspective, and our audience seems to be excited and intrigued by these ideas. We did have a question to come into the chat. Someone asks, succession discussions are usually based on retirement and usually not including other risk factors like prolonged illness or death. Could you shed some light on this?
It's a wonderful question. I think we actually need to be planning in two steps. The first that you mentioned is retirement and having kind of more of the conversation that we had today around how do we develop our teams and how do we kind of ensure that bench strength to have a population to be ready to step into that role. But that's a very different plan than kind of the emergency plan that we may need to put in place in the event of illness or unfortunate passing on of an individual. And so I think really having that mental shift of these are two different plans and we approach them differently. There is an emergency situation where we have to have kind of individual candidates that are ready to step in immediately, and that might look different than kind of what we're developing on a long-term basis, or layering on the factor of having an interim strategy to kind of bring someone in on a temporary basis to that role as well. So I appreciate the question, and I encourage you to think about them as two separate plans.
Excellent. Thank you. If there's any other questions, I'll give you all just 1 or 2 minutes to put it in the chat before we wrap things up. So go ahead. If there's any other questions, please put it in. I'm sorry, not the chat, the Q&A section, please. Well, Nell, it appears that you gave a very thorough presentation. So thank you so much for your time today. Again, it was very insightful. If there are any other questions that come up, feel free to put them in the chat and I can always forward them to Nell. If you figure, if you're thinking about this and you decide that you might want some more insight, I'm happy to do that. Um, with that, I want to thank everybody who joined us today. If you enjoyed this session and you're interested in more in-depth learning and global exchange, registration is now open for the World Credit Union Conference. World Council will co-host the premier global credit union event with the Customer Owned Banking Association in Sydney, Australia, from July 19th through July 22nd. You can scan the QR code on your screen to learn more and take advantage of our early bird registration. We'd love to see you there. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great rest of the day. And as a reminder, the session was recorded and will be available on Woku's YouTube channel later this week. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day, great morning, great evening, wherever you are.